to mention to all the table leaders, there are 2 questions when you get to the discussion of the questions that are meant for personal reflection, so not to be discussed at the table, and that's questions 3 and 9. Okay. 3 and 9. The other thing is I noticed there was a question that got into the list that was a mistake. It wasn't supposed to get in there. It was from a previous version of this that I was working on. But there's a question about why did Jesus do what he did? There is an answer in your book, but it wasn't in the part you were assigned to read. So if you flip to what was called page 1, actually go to the beginning of the book. There's an introduction page. And then 2 pages after that it says number 3, Judas's betrayal. So it's on the 2nd page with color. On the bottom it says number 3, Judas's betrayal. That's where you'll find the answers to that question. Okay, so when you get there, facilitators don't beat people up because they know the answer, because they don't know where to find it. So that's where you find the answer to that question. Okay? All right, so moving on. So last week when we started this conversation, we talked about where to begin the Passion narratives. We could have gone all the way back to the birth of Jesus, because even that is pointing forward to Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, but we said we weren't going to do that. It could be Jesus' predictions of his death that we began at. It could have been the entrance into Jerusalem, what we call Palm Sunday. It could have been those events leading up to the 3 days, but obviously we don't have time in 8 weeks to do all of that material. There's also the idea that if we're talking about Jesus' sufferings as his passion, that immediately precedes Jesus' death. So the agony in the garden seems to be a place where Jesus is showing his agony, his suffering, in the beginning of his passion. We can also say that up until the agony in the garden, through the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, set John aside for a second, Jesus is the primary actor. He's doing the acting, he's doing the speaking, he's doing the healing, he's doing the forgiveness of sins. He's acting upon other people. In the Passion, at the agony in the garden, it begins that Jesus is being acted upon. So you can look at, for the most part, from the agony in the garden forward to Jesus' death and burial, he's being acted upon. So that's another logical place to start the Passion account. So again, included in your books, you see those beginning pages, the ones before. For those of you who weren't here last week, you may not know to number your pages. And so we began, there's a page that has a letter C, it says Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus' prayer and Jesus' arrest. That's page 1. So if we refer to page numbers, that's what we're starting with, that's page 1. So you might want to write them in your books, especially those of you who weren't here last week who didn't know that. So again, there's a letter C, it says Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus' prayer and Jesus' arrest. That's page 1. Okay? All the stuff that comes before that, I would encourage you to read and reflect on, because all stuff that leads up to Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. Some pretty important stuff, things that happened in the Last Supper and so on. But it's not going to be what we're going to be talking about specifically here. So tonight what I want to present is some background information that I think will help you understand what's going on in the passages a little better than you might right now. And some specific things to pay attention to in the passages, the pericopes, remember that word from last week? The pericopes that you'll be talking about tonight. So that's what I want to do today. So I'm going to fast forward. To here. Okay. So the first thing I want to go over tonight is, for some of us who are visual people, we hear about these places and things in the scriptures, but we have no visual images of them, so it make it more abstract, a little harder to understand. So what I want to do is show you some of the places we're going to be talking about as they looked in Jesus' time and as they look today, just to help you have some visual for this. So I want to start with some geography of the Passion. This is a model in Jerusalem. So you see there's some people standing here, so it gives you an idea of how big this model is. There's some people standing over here too, so it's a pretty good-sized model of what Jerusalem looked like at the time of Jesus. Okay, they took it from original photographs. Sorry, I just wanted to see who I lost already. So, right here this little square right there, which relative to all these are all buildings, by the way. Okay, these are all residential buildings. These are big palaces and community buildings and things in here, and in this area here, and back there. This square right there is the temple at the time of Jesus, okay? That's how it's situated in Jerusalem. So this, it looks small, but it was enormous. This area around here, this whole fenced-in or kind of walled-in area, this is called the Temple Mount area. And so a lot of times when we hear about Jesus did this in the temple, Jesus did that in the temple, they're not talking about inside the building. That's the Holy of Holies. Jesus never went in there. Only the high priest went in there, and only once a year. Okay? So this is the temple, this is the temple area. This wall right here, these walls are retaining walls to hold the dirt in place that the temple sits on. Okay? The only thing we have left today of this entire structure is the wall on this side. You can't see from this angle, the wall that goes across here, down here, the supporting wall. That's called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. Okay, that's all that is left of the Temple Mount. So when somebody says the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, they're not talking about the wall of the temple itself. They're talking about the retaining wall. Because all the rest of this was destroyed in 70 AD, outstanding. All the rest of this was destroyed in 70 AD. Okay? Today, there's a mosque built in this area, the spot that they think the temple was. The other thing I want to point out here is this wall coming along here. Looks like there's a drop-off here. It's not just a drop-off because that's where they decided to stop building the model. It's a drop-off because this represents the Kidron River Valley that was dried up at the time of Jesus and is still dried up today. So when you hear the Kidron Valley, especially in John's Gospel, they're referring to this area right in here, a dried up river valley. Okay. Back in here is Herod's palace. And back in here is Caiaphas' palace, who was the high priest. We'll talk more about Herod and Caiaphas. So those are some important landmarks. Okay. Just to give you an idea of what Jerusalem looked like. And there's a wall all the way around it. It's not a wall, again, just for the model. It was a walled city. And so there was a wall all around the city, and there was gates in the city. Okay, Bob.
What would you estimate the scale at?
This wall, I want to say, is 60 feet tall. The real temple. Mm-hmm. And it looks like it's maybe about 4 feet tall here. Okay, so yeah, I would say maybe like a 115. That's a good question. I have to look that up. Okay, this is the wall of the old city today. Okay? Couple interesting things here. By the way, this dome here, that's the mosque that's standing on the spot where they think the temple used to stand, which is where the Muslims say Muhammad ascended into heaven. Okay, so it's a mosque there. No Jewish person would ever walk inside this area because you might accidentally step where the Holy of Holies was, and that would be a desecration. So no Jewish person would ever walk up here. I did, but I'm not Jewish. I'm sorry? Okay. In this wall here, it's hard to see, but there's two arches here. I don't know if you can see that a little bit where I'm tracing. That's the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate is where the Jewish people believe the Messiah will come into the old city, into Jerusalem from. Because remember, the Jewish people believe the Messiah hasn't come yet. We know he has, and his name is Jesus, but they don't think he's come yet. So they're expecting the Messiah to walk through the Golden Gate when he comes into Jerusalem. Well, when the Muslims took over the city, they knew that tradition. So they've made sure that the Messiah will never come. Because they've bricked in the gates. So the Messiah can't enter the old city because it's bricked up. And he can only come through the Golden Gate, so therefore he'll never come. Not like the Messiah can't knock down brick walls, but okay. That's the first thing they did to make sure the Messiah would never come. The other thing they did was this whole area in here, this lighter color, that's a cemetery. A Jewish person becomes unclean if they walk through a cemetery. They become unclean. So the Messiah would be unclean and therefore not worthy to be the Messiah because he has to pass through a cemetery. So they purposely put a cemetery there so the Messiah would never come. So between the graves here and the burnt up Golden Gate, we know the Messiah is never coming.
So this is the real picture.
This is real. This is Jerusalem today. Okay? You also can see that it's sloping down this way. See, the ground level up here is up here, but the ground level down here is down here. So you're coming down a slope, coming away from the walled city. Everybody goes up to Jerusalem, no matter which direction you're coming from, because it's on a hill. Coming down this way, this low area here is that same Kidron Valley. That's that same dried up river valley. So you see, you're coming off of Mount Zion, which is what Jerusalem's built on. You come down off Mount Zion, you're in a dried up river valley called the Kidron Valley. And in a second, I'll show you what's on the other side coming up this way from that Kidron Valley.
Why did they not want the Messiah to come?
The Muslims. The Muslims did that, not the Jews. The Jews want the Messiah to come. The Muslims, when they took over the city, when they conquered the area, they did this. So that the Messiah would never come. Because the Muslims don't want a Messiah. Because what's the Messiah going to do? Reestablish the rule for Israel.
Okay.
So that's the Muslims who did this. So they obviously believe the prophecies, right? They obviously believe the prophecies, but they're going to make sure the Messiah doesn't come.
You don't try to block something you don't believe in.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Why would I waste my time with something I think is hogwash? They obviously don't think it's hogwash. So that's the old city and the Golden Gate. We're not talking about the Last Supper, but the Last Supper is typically referred to as being in the upper room. Okay? There's debate in Jerusalem on where the upper room was. Most Catholics would say that the upper room is this space here. This building that was built in around 1000 AD. That's where the Last Supper took place. Thank you. Thank you. But the thinking is this building was built by the Byzantine Empire people 1000 AD over the spot where there was a building that housed the Last Supper. So this room is called the cenacle. You might see that word sometime, the cenacle. It's the upper room. And it's basically just an empty room. There's a stairway coming up here that goes to a doorway, leads out of that room. And these are these columns, but this is basically an empty room. But this is, they say, over the site where the Last Supper was held in the cenacle. However, there's another group of Christians in the Holy Land, the Syrian Orthodox, who can trace this building back to the 1st century. And it's believed it was the house of somebody named John Mark and his family. And remember that name, John Mark, from last week? The evangelist, the one that wrote the Gospel according to Mark. So they think that they can trace this house back to John Mark. It's a church now. It's a Syrian Orthodox church. I actually prayed there one night. And they say this is the place where the upper room was. The upper room was not just the place of the Last Supper, but it was also the place of the Pentecost event, when the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles at Pentecost. So the Syrian Orthodox will say this is the place where the upper room was, in this building, and most Catholics will say, no, it seems like the science points to that this building is built over the place where the upper room originally was. So either way, going to either place, it just helps you clear out the distractions to focus on the mystery that happened there. So it doesn't matter which one you want to believe. Okay, so here again is the wall of the old city of Jerusalem. Here's the Golden Gate. Here's those graves, right? So again, you're coming down, and you're down here in this valley. That's looking at it parallel to the old city. This is looking at it from the opposite direction at another angle. So you're seeing another hill over here, but this is the hill on Mount Zion that Jerusalem's built on. And then this is the Kidron Valley going this way now. So instead of going this way, it's going this way. It's just two different angles of the same. The interesting thing here, though, is there's another valley coming across this way. Between these two hills, coming down this way, there's another valley. It's called the Geh, or the Valley Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom. When you say it in Hebrew, it becomes Gehenna. Sound like a word that you've heard? Gehenna. It's where the word Gehenna comes from. Because in this valley here, there were some pagans that worshiped false gods. And the Jewish people regarded it as the gates of hell, the gates of the damned, because of the things that happened there, because of the false worship and stuff that was going on there. So that's the Gehenna. That's Gehenna, where the worm never turns. It's the place of the damned. So that becomes a development at the time of Jesus. It's developed from the Gehenna, because of everybody knowing what happens. It's called Gehenna, and that's what we see in the scriptures as the place of the damned. Okay, so the Kidron Valley coming up this way, and then the Gehenna coming across this way kind of intersect. And then again, so if this is coming down from Jerusalem to the Kidron Valley, coming up this side is the Mount of Olives. And I want you to just see how close all this is together. To walk from the Mount of Olives through the old city to the other side of the old city would take you 15, 20 minutes on foot. It's not a gigantic area. So it's not like you would think, it's like, well, Jesus went 15 miles from the Mount of Olives to Caiaphas' house, and no, it's like across the street practically. It's not a giant area. So I just wanted you to have this concept in your mind of what this area looks like. So there's the Mount of Olives. So again, this area down in here, this low point, is the Kidron Valley. This is the top of the wall around the old city. So now you're looking at it from the old city, looking towards the Mount of Olives, where before you're looking at the Mount of Olives, looking towards the old city. Got it? Mount of Olives is really, really, really important in the time of Jesus. There's a lot of things that happened on the Mount of Olives that are established churches now. So for example, up here, there's 3 different churches that claim to be the place where Jesus ascended into heaven. There's a Muslim place where they say Jesus ascended into heaven. Remember, for the Muslim, Jesus is a prophet, so they would honor the prophet. It's where they say he ascended into heaven. There's an Orthodox church and a Protestant church, all on the top of Mount of Olives, that say that they're the place where Jesus ascended into heaven. Down in this area here, there's a church. Anybody here been to the Holy Land? Okay, not yet, right? Next year in Jerusalem. There's a church called Dominus Flevit. In Latin, it means Jesus wept. When Jesus is approaching Jerusalem in the Gospels for his passion, death, and resurrection, he weeps over Jerusalem because they don't recognize the hour of their visitation. Okay? So there's a church built on it. It's shaped like a teardrop. And it's the place where Jesus wept. And there's a giant window right behind the altar that looks out onto the old city. So you're seeing what Jesus saw when he looked across there. Pretty cool. There's a church down in here, an Orthodox church, that claims to be the place where Mary was assumed into heaven. Across town, there's a Catholic church. It's the place where Mary was assumed into heaven. And in Ephesus, there's a church where Mary was assumed into heaven. So I'm guessing... there's an Orthodox church here called Mary Magdalene. Let's see. And then the big one down here is called the Church of All Nations. We'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. And then right outside here is a bunch of olive trees. Guess what that might be? Anybody? Anybody? The Garden of Gethsemane. Very good. Give that man a close up. So that's the Mount of Olives. And like I said, it takes probably about 10, 15 minutes to walk up a road up to the top of this. Well, more like a half an hour. It's a pretty good size hill. I went up and down it like 3 times. The last time I was there, I had to go up it again. I took a taxi up the back way. I started walking up and down that hill. So here's the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember I showed you that cluster of trees outside the Church of All Nations? This is those trees, okay? And this is the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, here's the interesting thing. Some of those trees in their present form are over 1,000 years old. 1,000 years old. But wait, the root structure underneath it is 2,000 years old. So those roots probably supply trees that have since decayed and new trees have grown up. So those roots and those trees, in essence, were there when Jesus prayed in this garden. When Jesus met there with his apostles. Pretty cool. By the way, Gethsemane means oil press. Go figure. Olive trees. There's an oil press. So even in Jesus' time, this place was occupied by olive trees. That's why it's called the Garden of Gethsemane. So there's that church again. Here's those olive trees. And then here's the church. It's called the Church of All Nations. It was built by the Byzantine era around 1000 AD. Over the spot where Jesus had his agony in the garden, where Jesus prayed. They say that this stone is the stone that Jesus prayed on, and stood on, and knelt on, and prayed on when he was praying to the Father on the night before his death. So there's a little iron fence around here so people don't go walking on it. But it's a Catholic church, so there's an altar there and a tabernacle. We have Mass in there. We're going to talk later about the Praetorium, but I just figured I'd throw this in right now since we're talking about this geography in the Holy Land. This wall here is that courtyard, that wall that we saw in the model of the temple. Remember there was that walled area all around it? That's this wall right here. So this is in that same model. So this is the temple area. These 4 columns here is called the Fortress Antonia. It's a Roman fortress that was built adjacent to the temple because Jerusalem tended to be, in those days, a hot spot. Go figure. 2,000 years later, it still is. But so the Romans wanted to make sure they had a military force by the center of the city. What's the center? Not only spiritually, but geographically, societally, civically, Jerusalem was it. And the temple area represented Jerusalem, so they wanted to make sure their presence was right by the temple. Okay, so that's the Fortress Antonia. This is Herod's palace. This whole area here, including these towers, this is all Herod's palace. And then here's the temple. Okay, and there's the temple wall around it. And there's the Fortress Antonia. So I wanted you to see where the distance is and what the location of Herod's palace relative to the temple and the Fortress Antonia. So the Praetorium is a fancy Latin word that means the place of the praetor. Now what's the praetor? The military leader of the area. So the Praetorium is the place where the military leader lives. Now, who was the military leader at that time? We all know his name.
Pontius Pilate.
Pontius Pilate, very good. Another Rose of Latin, very good. So that's that Andrean education. No comment from the Bishop Noel people. So the Praetorium is the place where Pontius Pilate lived. Pontius Pilate didn't live in Jerusalem. Pontius Pilate lived in Caesarea Philippi, which is a very well-developed, wealthy city on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. That's where he lived. When he came to Jerusalem, he had to have a place to stay. So he's in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' arrest, as we'll hear about. But where did he stay? So some scholars will argue that he stayed at the Praetorium because he's the praetor. So he stayed at the fortress with his troops. Okay? Or some people say he stayed in the nice palace of Herod, because Herod's a king who's put in power by the Romans. So Pilate has Herod in his hip pocket. Right? The only reason he has any authority is because Rome put him there. Who's Rome in this area? Pilate. So, and this is a whole lot nicer place to stay than the Fortress Antonia. So some theologians will say he stayed at Herod's palace. Some people say he stayed at the Fortress Antonia. Just thought I'd throw those things out there so you can kind of see, again, the geography, the layout. Temple area. What's on the other side of the temple? The Kidron River Valley. What's on the other side of the Kidron River Valley? Mount of Olives. Okay. So you got Mount of Olives over here. You got the Kidron Valley down here. You come up the wall. You've got the temple area, the Golden Gates over here. You've got the Fortress Antonia. You've got Herod's palace. Okay. Again, I just thought some of this would help you visualize as you're reading these passages. You have something you can think about what it looked like. Okay. Any questions on that? Good. The only thing I want to do now is I want to talk about the 2 sections of the readings that you had for tonight. So Jesus' prayer and Jesus' arrest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain it starting with Mark, then talking about Matthew, then I'll talk about Luke and John. Okay? I'm going to point out the things that I think are unique or important in Mark's version, Matthew's version, Luke's version, and John's version. So, in Mark, Jesus is the obedient Son of God, struggling to accept God's will. So how do we know he's struggling to accept God's will? Father, let this cup pass from me, right? Does that sound like a person who's having an easy time accepting God's will? No. So Mark is writing that Jesus is the Son of God who is struggling to accept God's will, but is obedient. Okay? Because he does it, right? Well, we all know that because we're here, right? We're not in synagogue tonight. So the obedient Son of God struggling to accept God's will. The apostles. The apostles in this passage are hopelessly unaware of what's going on. They don't have a clue of what's going on. But that's consistent with what we said last week about the apostles in Mark's gospel, isn't it? They don't understand what's going on. Nobody understands what's going on until the centurion, much, much later, because they've been to the cross. The apostles don't understand what's going on because they don't really get who Jesus is. So they don't understand this. But Mark makes them look hopelessly unaware of what's going on because he doesn't want us to be like them. He doesn't want us to not know what's going on. He wants us to know what's going on. So he sets up the apostles as a way not to be. Jesus, for his part, is disturbed and troubled, right? He's praying in agony to the Father. So he's obviously troubled by what's going on. Now remember the synoptics we said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Were they emphasizing more his humanity or his divinity? Humanity. So if Jesus is fully human, he can't fully understand what's going on, right? Because nobody in their human intellect knows everything. So in his humanity, Jesus doesn't fully get what's going on. But he doesn't have to, because he trusts the Father. He doesn't have to understand everything because he trusts. He is disturbed and troubled, but we know when he prays, right? Let this cup pass, but your will be done. If you want to see more about how Jesus is described as being troubled and disturbed as God's suffering servant, you might want to take a look at Psalm 42 when you have a chance. You'll hear some more about how God's servant is disturbed and troubled. And the last thing I want to say about Mark is Jesus' hour has come. 3 times in Mark's Gospel, not in the section that we read, but previously in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10, 3 times Jesus predicts what's going to happen to him. He tells his disciples exactly what's going to happen. And he says his hour, he refers to his hour. The hour when the purpose he came for will be fulfilled. And so Mark's Jesus at this point has Jesus understanding that his hour has now come, just like he predicted in Mark 8, Mark 9, and Mark 10. Matthew, his text, if you looked at that page carefully, it was page 1. Look how much is in blue. Blue means Mark and Matthew are identical in those verses. Look how much Mark and Matthew are identical. But as opposed to that, look at Luke. Nothing in blue. Okay, there's a few things in green, just a few sentences in green. That means that's what's the same across Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you see there's very little green. But there's lots of blue. Matthew and Mark are giving you a lot of the same stuff. But in Matthew's case, he gives you 3 clear instances when Jesus prays and goes back and finds his disciples. Comes back and prays, goes back and finds his disciples. Comes back and prays, goes back and finds his disciples sleeping. So there's 3 specific moments of that in Matthew. So Matthew tends to take Mark and make it more dramatic. So when Mark has this happening where Jesus prays and then finds his disciples, to make it more dramatic, Matthew does it 3 times. Somebody asked me the other day, well, doesn't that make it a lie? No, because you got to remember what Matthew and Mark are trying to do. They're trying to paint a portrait of who Jesus is for a particular audience with particular needs. Okay, so it's a portrait. Remember, it's not the historical Jesus or the actual Jesus, it's the gospel of Jesus. Okay. Luke, as you see, doesn't have much the same as Matthew and Mark. But Luke has something very, very interesting. Two things, actually. The first one is